In the previous episode, we saw that BRENSO can generate many waveforms through a series of electronic tricks that are pretty common with analog oscillators. However, we left behind a very important topic, the white section. We already explained it in BRENSO's tutorial that you can find here and in the description, but I think that today we can dive more into some of its features and explain the design and the thought process behind them. So today I would like to start with the pulse width modulation because it is quite nice and it's capable of creating interesting timbres, even though it is not one of the most obvious ones. Because yes, the BRENSO can do pulse width modulation and we already shot a few videos on that. So how is that possible? Well, you have to know that BRENSO generates in the yellow oscillator not one but two square waves. One is the one derived from the triangle course logic that we described in this other video. The second one is a little bit buried into the white section, but it's actually the beginning of our pulse shaper. In the white section we have two wave shaper, one that shapes the triangle wave and the other one that shapes a pulse wave generated from the triangle wave. And both feed a crossfader that in turn feeds the wave folder. And that's the white section. But through this output here we can choose to take the signal straight after the pulse shaper and thus bypassing this section and this one. When this switch is on the leftmost position, we listen to the square wave straight from the course logic that we listen and we demonstrate the other time. But as we set it to the rightmost position, we can hear this pulse shaper here bypassing this section and this one. We can hear that the shaper circuit emphasizes the low end here and then progressively introduces higher overtones, and then around this position here is emphasizing the high range and scooping down the low range. And here we have basically the same sound as here, but with inverted phase, as the graphic suggests. We will see why this inversion later on. But if we set it roughly to noon, we would have quite a good approximation of our pulse wave. So we're gonna leave it like here to better appreciate the pulse width modulation, and this is how it works. The triangle wave straight from the core feeds a comparator. The comparator is a circuit that receives any signal but outputs only two states, on and off. To choose whether such states are positive or negative, the comparator, as the name suggests, compare the signal to a threshold that can be fixed on some comparator, like the one that generates the square wave straight from the logic, or arbitrarily set by the user, like us, like in this case here. So whenever the incoming signal is equal or above a certain threshold, the comparator outputs a high signal, and when it is lower, it outputs a low signal. So if we feed a comparator with a triangle wave, whenever the waveform is above the threshold, the signal will be high, and whenever it is lower, it will be low. Now, if our comparator threshold is set to 0 volt, and if our triangle core is bipolar, we will obtain a theoretically perfect square wave. The difference between the other square wave that we have on BRENSO's yellow oscillator is that this second one is rotated by 90 degrees. The other one, as we already explained, is created with the logic states within the triangle core, and they are on when the triangle is descending and off when the triangle is ascending, while this one is on when the triangle is positive and off when the triangle is negative, and this introduces a 90-degree phase rotation. Now this control here basically defines the comparator threshold, and if I rotate it in this way it will be high, if I rotate it in this way it will be low, and if I set it roughly around the middle it will be in the center, so it will give me an almost perfect pulse wave. And as a matter of fact, if I compare it to the actual pulse wave, they will sound the exact same. So the good thing on the BRENSO is that we can modulate this comparator threshold also with external CV, and by doing so we are also changing the symmetry of our pulse wave, also called duty cycle or width, hence the definition of pulse width modulation. By changing the symmetry, we are also changing the proportion and the amplitude of its overtones. Let's pause for a moment and focus on the overtones. We know from another video that a square wave contains only the odd harmonics and their amplitude descends in a linear proportion. But what happens with a more rectangular waveform? The topic might be too tricky and my math skills are certainly not up to the task, but as a rule of thumb, we can say that the fraction of the duty cycle determines the harmonics that are missing from the final waveform. For example, our square wave has a 50% duty cycle, which is a half up and a half down. So every second harmonic is missing from the spectrum, and that's what we already knew. If, however, our pulse wave is 1/3 positive, every third harmonic will be missing. If it is 1/4, every fourth, and so on. But what if the positive side is longer than the negative one? Well, it's kind of the same, but with inverted phase. That is the rule of thumb to understand how pulse width modulation affects our timbre. So if we modulate our comparator threshold, perhaps with an LFO, we obtain a famous effect of the pulse width modulation that has become a staple of East Coast synthesis, for example. This technique is very helpful when we want to fake more oscillator, because the result of a LFO'd pulse width modulation is similar to two square waves slightly detuned. So these are two oscillators from the BRENSO, the yellow square wave straight from the oscillator core, and a sawtooth or another square wave. And this is the pulse width modulated single oscillator. You can hear that this is very convenient because it allows you to fake a bigger sound with only one oscillator. As you may have listened, and as we already introduced earlier, if we set our comparator threshold towards one or the other of its extremes, we might obtain two sonically similar results or even identical. However, their phase is inverted. And while this is not an issue when we listen to the sound alone, when we start processing it or mixing with other sources, it can introduce some interesting differences. So right now we have the pulse shaper set to noon, which is the most vanilla and the closest we can get to the pulse wave, and we are folding it. We set the source knob all the way to the right, which is mostly pulse wave, and we are folding it. And we can hear that now. Can perceive a tiny difference, but nothing too extreme. However, if we change the wavefolder symmetry a bit, like this, it has become something completely different. Because now we are dealing with an asymmetrical modulation, and so the weight of this waveform, the weight of the parts that are above or below the central value, has changed at this stage. And the same is true for this other phase inversion that we can introduce in our sound. So when we are listening to the sound alone, like this, it's basically the same, but as long as we start processing it with the wavefolder, so by combining the duty cycle, the phase of our pulse shaper, and the symmetry of our wavefolder, we unlock a wide variety of subtle changes that can make a difference in a thorough sound design process. So right now we are summing two oscillators, and by changing duty cycle, you can choose to emphasize certain frequencies. Theoretically, a triangle wave is the best input for a comparator to generate a pulse wave. But on the BRENSO, we can also use another signal, which is the other wave shaper. And we do it through this switch down here. As you can see, now we kept it on the leftmost position, which highlights the triangle core as a source, but we can set it to the right and use this here instead as our comparator source. So you may also think that now the two wave folders are also in series rather than just in parallel as before. So instead of having a triangle wave as a source, we have a waveform that changes from a triangle to a sine to a sort of logarithmic waveform, on which we might dive more into another video. If you're interested into that, let me know as usual in the comments below. Anyway, if we select the other waveform as our comparator source, we still get a pulse wave. It's basically the same kind of timbre. It's not gonna change our timbre too much, because after all the comparator only has two states, low or high. But this way we are able to modulate the pulse width through the other wave shaper. So instead of moving the comparator threshold, we are still able to get a pulse width modulation by keeping it fixed and changing the point at which the other waveform crosses it. It is a much more delicate PWM, but it is still very effective and has one great advantage, because in this way we can obtain a PWM basically without any patching, because we can scale the green oscillator down to LFO range and take advantage of the fact that this sine wave goes here into the modulation bus and from here goes to all of these parameters here, and so we can open it up and send it to modulate the first oscillator, the first wave shaper. And so by finding a good spot for the comparator threshold and keeping it fixed, we can obtain a PWM without any patch cables. The triangle shaper works on the triangle waves straight from the core, so the two pulse waves that we obtain on the BRENSO, either this or this, are phase consistent. Another thing worth keeping in mind is that by doing this kind of PWM, we can choose to have our LFO free running, or we can lock it to the volt per octave signal that we are using to modulate this one. And so it will go faster with higher notes and slower with the lower ones. If we patch everything through a nice low pass filter. And so this was our introduction to pulse wave and to pulse width modulation, and I think that we can cap it here for today. In other videos we might talk more about BRENSO's white section, so if you're interested into that, as always, let me know in the comments below. For now, I hope you found this video useful and I will see you next time.